Great Lakes Now, Connect is a co-production of Detroit Public Television and the Nature Conservancy.
Hi there and welcome to Great Lakes Now Connect. I'm Christy McDonald. We are so glad that you're joining us as Detroit Public Television and the Nature Conservancy team up to focus on some of the most unique aspects of the Great Lakes and some of the biggest challenges facing the Great Lakes region. For the next hour, we are going to take a closer look at what we like to call the wild places of the Great Lakes. You may not realize, but the Great Lakes are home to some of North America's youngest and most dynamic habitats, and perhaps you've had a chance to experience some of them. The world's largest freshwater dune system, northern forests, or those oak savannas. All of these diverse habitats affect wildlife as well as the health of the Great Lakes themselves. So today we're going to introduce you to some of those wild places that are even close to big cities like Chicago and Cleveland, Duluth, and even right here in Detroit. And we're going to give you a better idea of how you can not only enjoy these wild places and learn about them, but help protect them as well. We have a great studio audience with us here today, and they are going to get a chance to ask questions. And we'd like you to get involved too at home. Just find us on Facebook and on Twitter at Great Lakes Now to take part in the conversation. So let's get started right now with Dr. Patrick Doran. He is the Director of Conservation at the Nature Conservancy in Michigan. And Patrick, it is always good to see you.
Nice to see you too, Christy.
All right, I love it. We're going to be talking about wild places today. And when you think about wild places, what are some of those places that people may not even realize that are so close to them at home?
You know, this is the reason I became a biologist, a conservation person. I think of when you come to Michigan or the Great Lakes, you think of these grand dunes. We have the world's largest collection of freshwater dunes. You think of the northern forest, millions and millions of acres of forest across the whole northern part of the Great Lakes Basin that gives us our clean water and our clean air. You think about the fens and the wetlands that just dot the landscape, hundreds of thousands of them that are really kind of the beginnings of these great rivers that feed these Great Lakes. I think of the coastal areas, this dynamic coast. We have more coastline in the Great Lakes than we do in all the eastern seaboard. Think about that. That's how much coastline we have. And I think you mentioned oak savannas and barrens. It's one of the most rare habitat types we have in the Great Lakes, but you go down the Toledo area, the oak barrens or some of the prairies, we have these things in the Great Lakes. You might not know them. Some are a long drive from home, and some of them really are literally out your back door.
You know, a lot of these beautiful places we may take for granted that they're right here in the Great Lakes Basin for us to enjoy. So I know you always do a good family road trip every summer. So you have to tell me, what are some of the, I guess, the wild places that you've taken your family and kind of gone a step beyond what you learn in the brochure?
Well, later on in today's episode, we'll talk about some of those people's favorite wild places. With my family, my wife and children, we often go to the Sleeping Bear Dunes area of Michigan. It's a great place. It's just absolutely beautiful and iconic. A couple years ago, we went up there. I don't know, we didn't get reservations at a campground, but we just drove up and somehow we're the last one pulled in and got a campsite. But we took a couple hikes that just weren't, you can do the Grand Dune climb, which is great.
I've done that.
Yes,
it's a workout, right?
I have a video with my mom and dad running down the dunes from the 70s. But we found a couple extra hikes. Most people climb over those dunes and go all the way to Lake Michigan. We skipped that and went around and found this 1 3-mile hike. And we went for a hike and did not see a single person on the 3-mile hike. This is in one of the most popular places in Michigan. We found another little lake back in there that like 1 or 2 people visited a little lake. Well, there's just a little inland lake because everybody's going to the big beaches. But there's these little dotted inland lakes. We bought our canoe and we just spent the whole day there just tooling around. I think any place like that, even a popular place like that, you can just find this just a little bit further off trail, you can find these special places.
I like to hear about this stuff that's a little off the beaten track.
I'm not going to tell you.
Don't tell me where it was. All right, he's going to keep that a secret. But so the next question, I guess, would be, how do we help protect these wild places? How can we help out?
Again, I sometimes get a little geeky on you, but the word protection means lots of different things to lots of different people. We'll talk today about formally protected areas like our national parks or wilderness areas, a formal legal designation of protection of them. So we can do those things. We can establish a state park or a national park. We can establish a preserve from an organization like the Nature Conservancy or other land conservancies. We can protect those. But oftentimes people think that maybe you can just protect something and then you're okay. Well, you know what? You're not okay. It's like buying a new house. You might buy a new house. Well, you gotta fix the roof after a little while. You gotta make sure there's no leaks. You gotta make sure your heating and air conditioning work.
Constant
the same
upkeep.
Thing.
Then
we have constant upkeep. We have constant care and attention and stewarding these lands and waters that we care about. So, if you want to protect them, We got to pay attention to that. And everybody, to me, is part of that community. Again, my organization, we own preserves. We can employ people, but we also do things like engage a number of volunteers. We'll see a great video on some volunteers today. We have volunteer field days with major corporations like Delta or Ford will come. So I think people can protect these wild places in a variety of ways. They can support the acquisition of these types of places, but once we have those places, they can dedicate their time, their energy, and their resources. But to me, it always boils down to the first thing, get yourself outside and see those places, because once you see them, you start to build that ethic of care.
Sounds good, and it wouldn't be a Great Lakes Now Connect without you getting a little geeky on it.
Yes,
so we like that. We look forward to that for the next hour. You know, people everywhere care about wild places, whether they grew up with nature nearby or they just visited occasionally. One man has made it his mission over the last 25 years to protect one of the wildest places in the Great Lakes. Meet Don Keith, or as locals like to call him, Mr. Keweenaw.
As a rural youth growing up down south, I guess hiking, in other words, is something I've done all my life. I've worn out many pairs of boots, and I've got a backpack that has hundreds of miles on it. Quite frankly, I think that the best way to improve your mental health and physical health is to get outdoors. Any trip that you take, short or long, any day or night, it's not so much the hike, it's what you see and do getting there. If it's a wildflower or a bird or anything out in nature. I'm Don Keith from Michigan's northernmost county, the Keweenaw. The Keweenaw is a very special place. There is so much up here that is deserving to be protected. Areas like the Estevant pines that were in danger of being logged, you can come and put your hand against a tree that's 400 years old. There's a lot of places in this state that you are hard put to find a tree of that age anymore. There's numerous places you can watch a sunset. My favorite place is Brockway Mountain, the highest elevation that you can drive an automobile over in the entire Midwest. It always will be a public place for future generations so they can see the sunsets from the top of Brockway with its $1 million view of that big snowmaking monster to the north, Lake Superior. Every piece of land that we can acquire is critical for the future. The land that you see here is unique, in other words, to much of the country. If you truly want to see a wild part of Michigan, and see Michigan as it was 200 years ago, come to the Keweenaw. It's your best opportunity. The efforts made in the last 2 decades have been giant steps into shaping the future. I'm so pleased to see that there's so many forward-looking people that are willing to contribute the efforts and was there to preserve some of the Keweenaw. I have fallen in love with and have a deep respect for the land up here and the stewardship that it deserves. I'm aware that I've been allowed for many years now to enjoy something that I believe that future generations ought to have an opportunity as I have had.
Wow, that was the perfect introduction to some wild places. What great imagery. My family and I had the pleasure of visiting the Keweenaw last year, and it's just as breathtaking as on that video. So today I'd like to introduce our guests. We have Phyllis Green, who's the Park Superintendent of Isle Royale National Park, just a stone's throw, a really long stone's throw from the Keweenaw Peninsula. And Marion Stranick, who is the past park superintendent of Point Paley National Park in Canada, in Ontario, Canada, not too far from Windsor and from Detroit, Michigan. So thank you for coming here today. It's really neat to have both of you here because you have very similar positions and very similar careers, but in 2 places that are very distant from one another. Both distant in time, like billions of years distant, but also in true distance. You know, it's going to take you a long day's drive to get from one place to the other. But one place is Marion, where you work in Point Paley. It's fairly new, 10,000 years old, newly had a dynamic in the place. Phyllis where you work is a billion or so years old, so quite long. But I want to get back to that as we saw there with Mr. Keweenaw, that personal connection. Phyllis, you were telling me earlier today before we started that you helped protect some of those places in that video with a bake sale.
Well, yeah. They showed you Estevan pines, which is pretty phenomenal, similar to Heartwood pines in the southern peninsula. But when I was about 16, the leader to try to save those pines was a Jim Rook, and he engaged the youth of the area. And so basically we were doing bake sales and whatever we could, and I don't know if we really raised more a couple than $1,000, where he was after tens of thousands to, you know, buy that spot. But we were able to do it. And then my other kind of early experiences, when the DNR Commission had a discussion about whether the Porcupine Wilderness should become Wilderness a state park, I went and spoke in front of the commissioners downstate here at about age 16 or 17, saying that I fully supported that it should be a wilderness area. But the interesting discussion was 2 speakers later, my father got up and he goes, you know, that young woman before me, I'm very proud of her, but we don't always agree. And he said, basically, he said, she represents youth, I represent the aged. And you know, for me, if it goes to wilderness, it will be more difficult to access. I won't be able to get in there. And so he gave a totally different perspective. And actually, my dinner time conversations were always all over the board, which I think helps me be a better public manager.
That's excellent. Yes, you had some of that conflict right up front.
Yeah.
I mean, it's similar
It's
kind
all
of
about
experience.
connections.
Yeah, what are those connections for you when you started at Point Pelee?
Well, I graduated from university, and my professor, botany professor, got a phone call, and Parks Canada was looking for somebody who could do a contract on invasive species at Point Pelee. And that's how I started my career. And interestingly, that's where I ended my career too.
Yeah. So that time spent at those places, I want to kind of back up a little bit and talk about some geological history. Again, these places are separated by a billion years. When we go to the Keweenaw or go to Iowa, those are some of the oldest rocks you stand on in the whole world, right?
Right. The world is about 4.5 billion years, give or take a half a billion. And Isle Royale is part of 450 lava flows. And when you walk the spine of the park or the Keweenaw Peninsula, you're on some of the oldest rock that ever came out of the oceans. So there's a timeless quality to that park that's purely amazing, but it also sets the park up for a very different transition zone. It actually is boreal on one end, so it connects with Canada, and it's hardwoods on the southern end, so it's more like a lot of the places south of it. But it also has what's called Arctic disjunct species, and it has it has some species of plants from the Pacific Northwest that, don't ask me how they're at Isle Royale, and they're in the Pacific Northwest. But it's very unique flora and fauna and geology.
And so, but at the opposite end of the spectrum, Point Pelee, that does have some relics that old, but 10,000 years ago,
we're
it
considered
was
relatively young.
It was scoured off by glaciers.
That's
so
right.
It's a very dynamic system that has a disturbance and wind and wave and energy. So what about a little bit about Point Pelee?
Well, basically, the peninsula on which the park sits on a ridge built of fragments.
Rubble from
that's
us,
right.
yes.
And it divides the western basin and the central basin of Lake Erie. And you're absolutely right. It's a sand spit. But interestingly, it may only be about 15 square kilometers, which is about, I think, 8 square miles. It's pretty small, but the complexity, we have one of the largest remaining Great Lakes marshes, we have forest, swamp, and dryland. And the interesting part about us is we're on the northern edge of what's considered eastern deciduous forest, which is eastern North America. Yeah.
So we can talk about those kind of the wildlife and the wildness and the habitat types, but what are some other aspects of wild places that people don't necessarily normally think about?
Well, I think people forget about soundscapes and night skies. Basically at Isle Royale, it's one of the most phenomenal places to watch the northern lights or to sit and watch Venus come out of Lake Superior. It's just a spectacular night sky, but it actually can be influenced by Canadian city on the far side and also then soundscapes. I can sit on my dock and I can hear the compressive sound of a raven flying over when his wings do the wing stroke. I mean, that's how quiet it is out there unless Lake Superior is acting up and then you can't hear anything but waves.
Yeah, do you see some of those same experiences on
Same,
Lake
yeah,
Erie?
very, very much the sound and the night skies. And for us, it's a real challenge because if you think about where we are in the very southern part of the Great Lakes, we're talking about a sea of humanity. And in amongst, we're a wild place in amongst that. So for us, it's the whole idea of once you step inside the boundaries of the national park, it's like you're in this oasis, and the absence of any kind of man-made or manicured landscape, it just is calming, has a really calming influence.
So real quickly, what do you see as some of the big threats or that we're worried about on some of these places? Just off the top of your head, the kind of general list.
For us, it's fragmentation. The size, for us, our ecosystems are so small, there's no buffer zone, so if processes are absent or there's invasives, it's a big deal.
And you mentioned a few things for Isle Royale that we don't necessarily think about.
Yeah, Isle Royale, it's the things that are hard to deal with or control. It's climate change, altering the temperature of lakes. I may lose one of my first species, a fish species, at Isle Royale this year. We may document its passing. It also is airborne pollutants coming in from long distances and, of course, invasive species.
Yeah, so those are going to be some good fodder for some questions. So, Christy, I think we might have some questions from the studio audience.
All right, so let's open it up. You've already started to hear a little bit about wild places and some of the concerns we have. Who has a question here in the studio audience? Anybody have a question? This young lady right here? Come on over here. All right, go ahead. Tell us your name.
Carly Dorn.
Okay, Carly, and go ahead. What's your question?
What are some of the wildest things that you guys have seen in these places?
Well,
Go ahead.
all right, I'll go for the wildest. This one's really up close and personal for me. It's probably a eastern fox snake, which is a rare and endangered snake. And they get to be about 6 to 8 feet long, one hanging off my hand.
Oh.
He was a terrified, he or she was a terrified snake that I was trying to rescue. They were basking in the sun on the road, and so I had gone to pick it up and snapped on and did not let go until I walked to the side and laid it into the grass, and then it let go. And so that was pretty cool because, like I said, they're 8-foot snakes, they're constrictors, they're pretty impressive.
Phyllis, any wild experiences?
Yeah, I actually got to watch 2 eagles fledge over the course of several weeks' time. Before I started work at 8 o'clock on a visitor center in Lake Winnebagoshish, I would go to the nest and I would watch them. And you would think that it's just all intuitive. There was a lot of conversation going on in this whole process. We don't have enough time to go into it, but it was just wonderful to watch. And I saw one on the first flight off, and it was really spectacular.
Wow. Anybody else have any questions? Come on over here, ma'am. Stand right here. Go ahead, tell us your name.
I'm Judy Kelly.
Okay, Judy, what's your question?
I have a question about climate change and imperiled species. What options have been taken to protect them, because the plants can't migrate north as the climate migrates north? And so are they going to be moved to new habitats, or what can happen?
Thanks, Judy.
You want to start?
That's a complex question. For us, we're on the edge of, as I mentioned, a range. So we constantly are seeing new species being introduced, and we have been doing a lot of restoration work, which creates new spaces for these species to move in. So.
Yeah, I think genetic banks are going to be pretty critical in the future, especially for plant species where you can do it. At the park itself, it has enough of a transition zone. I'm afraid what we'll lose is the Arctic disjuncts, but they are they are up in the Arctic. They've been separated since glaciation, though, so I think we have a different genetic setup on our, but we've never spent the money to really sort it all out. So right now I would tell you we're struggling to figure it out, and it's something we need to struggle with the public with a little bit more, because there's no easy answers.
I think one of the controversies is when to intervene and when not to intervene, which is really no particular answer for.
And I want to pick up on something that Mary said and ask you, you talked about restoration. Are restoration projects more difficult or any different in some of these wild places than when we're talking about other habitats?
Yeah, I would say not so much different, but much more research is required, much more sourcing of your seed banks, and then also to the growing of those to propagate them, to bring them back into the park. So there's a whole science just being built in itself in restoration, because it's becoming more and more of a requirement in order to protect and preserve wild places.
All right, do we have one last question we want to get to? Hi, ma'am, come on over here. Hello, what's your name?
Veronica Gracia Wing.
Okay, Veronica, go ahead and ask your question.
So at the top of the show, you chatted a bit about some of the larger things that we could do as Great Lakes residents to make an impact and preserve and conserve these spaces. What are some of the more everyday things that we can do as Great Lakes residents to help these spaces?
That's a great question. Thank you very much.
You know, one of my favorite things is I have wild places in my backyard. I landscape with native plants from the region. I try to provide the basics, you know, the food and the shelter and the water, because I think you can have that wildness or those wild experiences in your backyard, as well as these majestic or wonderful or backyard places we go to.
All right. Okay, so that's what we're going to do for questions from the audience right now. You know, basically the big question, what Veronica just asked, what can we do to make an impact and help protect these wild places? You know, every Saturday, Chuck Pearson heads out to the Ives Road Fens. Chuck is what you'd call a super volunteer. He's dedicated over 10,000 hours of time to help restore the Ives Road Fens by cleaning out invasive species and helping protect this unique site. It is not easy work, but here's a look at why Chuck is so passionate about it.
It's sunrise on the side of Raisin Center Highway in Tecumseh, Michigan, less than an hour's drive from Detroit. Morning commuters make their way to work, unaware of the rare ecosystem just down the hill, where a hidden wilderness is thriving and nature's dramas unfold every day. This common yellowthroat scours tangled vegetation in search of insects to take back to its nest. The chicks will have a hearty breakfast this morning. A white-tailed deer stirs up some resting red-winged blackbirds. But there are no hard feelings. On the ground, carnivorous plants receive their nutrients, not from the soil, but from insects they trap. This pitcher plant's slippery hairs cause unsuspecting insects to slip into a pool of digestive enzymes, where they're converted into nitrogen for nourishment. All this is happening on the 700 acres of the Ives Road Fen Nature Preserve. Everywhere you look at Ives, life is thriving, and this is possible because of the work of people like Chuck Pearson. Chuck has logged more than 10,000 hours volunteering to restore wildlife at Ives.
I do that partly to preserve it for other people and future generations, partly I like the exercise is good for me, keeps me fit. I get to meet people. I get to see interesting plants and animals. I get a sense of accomplishment.
After retiring from his job as an engineer at Ford, hardly a day has gone by that Chuck hasn't done something to help improve this nature preserve. Every Saturday, he's joined by a group of volunteers that share his passion, getting their hands dirty to restore a rare and beautiful place.
I mean, yes, you sweat and you complain and you're exhausted at the end of the day, but at the same time you have a real feeling of accomplishment. And I like the people I work with. We joke around with one another, we look forward to seeing one another. It's actually a lot of fun.
This week, the volunteers were working to restore an upland prairie, but most of the work is focused on preserving the rare and vulnerable habitat that gives the preserve its namesake, the prairie fen. The history of this landscape is written in the chemistry of the groundwater. It's percolating up through limestone substrate deposited by glaciers at the end of the last ice age. The limestone makes the water flowing through it rich in calcium and low in acidity, or alkaline. It's this alkaline groundwater that makes this wetland prairie a fen.
Fens are globally rare wetland communities. They've generally been heavily impacted by human disturbance over time, so there aren't that many around. They're very unique, and they have high plant diversity and animal diversity, so they're just very diverse and unique communities that we want to protect.
Chris May manages preserves all over the Great Lakes state for the Nature Conservancy. One of his greatest responsibilities is dealing with plants and animals that don't belong in North America.
One of the biggest threats to our preserves across the state, and Ives Road Fen in particular, are invasive plant species. They're a problem because they form what we call monocultures in some cases, and so there's nothing growing in that area except a particular species that's from another part of the world.
At Ives, the main culprit is a plant called glossy buckthorn. After it was imported from Eurasia, it spread prolifically. Without intervention of conservationists, this fen wouldn't exist as a diverse wildlife sanctuary. Instead, it would be a field of nothing but glossy buckthorn, providing neither food nor habitat for the many life forms thriving here, including a number of rare and endangered species. This untreated stand of buckthorn shows the contrast between plant diversity and what the fen would look like without restoration.
When we acquired Ives Road Fen, there were about 5 or 10 acres of prairie fen on the preserve, and we've expanded that to almost 100 acres through our restoration practices. So restoration is really a way to bring back the wildness to these historically diverse communities.
I will admit, when I first came down here, there were so many invasive species all over the fen that I thought we were engaging in exercise in futility, that it was a feel-good project, but we'd never cut it faster than it grew back. But over time, we started making headway. We saw the native plants come back, and it's just a real feeling of accomplishment.
This is the last remaining patch of mature buckthorn at Ives. Once removed, this fen will once again exist as it did before European settlement. About 70 miles away in the Shiawassee River watershed, a large glossy buckthorn stands in another fen. It's here that Central Michigan University researcher Clint Pogue is leading a study on a rare butterfly found only in prairie fen habitats. The Poe chic skipperling is a modest-looking butterfly. There's nothing showy about it, but its critically imperiled status makes it worthy of Clint's study.
It's sort of the canary in the coal mine for prairie fens. It's on the decline, but we don't know why. And so we would like to understand what's causing it, because it might have larger implications for the entire natural community.
By surveying fens around the area for the presence of Poe chic skipperling and plants associated with it, Clint is building a better understanding about fens as unique, specialized systems.
We want to conserve these centers of biodiversity. If we don't take the time to learn about the ecosystem, to learn about the species here, we're losing a great natural resource.
All of this research and restoration is for the sake of preserving wilderness in a part of the Great Lakes Basin where little wilderness remains.
This is just as much of a wilderness as the Rockies or Grand Canyon or someplace like that. I can guarantee you that if you come to Ives Road Fen Preserve instead, you will see more flowers and more butterflies and more birds.
So the next time you want to get away, look at a local nature preserve. You might be surprised at what you find there.
Wow, 10,000 hours is kind of that conventional wisdom that it takes 10,000 hours before you're an expert in something. I guess Chuck's an expert now. So that's incredible. You know, we have our favorite wild places, whether it's the grandeur of the Keweenaw Peninsula that's, you know, so far away and so big and so vast, or the kind of backyard, next door nature of a place like Ives Road Fen. It's exciting, and sometimes it puts me at ease kind of knowing these places exist and that they're protected for future generations. But again, we get back to what is protected and what do we have to do to make sure something is protected. and how do we go about that? So I think in this part of our discussion, we kind of want to delve into a little bit about what does protection mean? What does it mean to take care of these places? What does it mean to ensure that these places exist and are well cared for well into the future? So we talked about Point Pelee being a national park. What does it mean to be a national park? What kind of protection takes place there? What's allowed? What's not allowed? What do you do? Can I go hunting there?
No. That's a simple answer. National park, that's in Canada, I would say that that's probably one of the highest sort of legislated protections. What happens there is the focus is on ecosystem health, ecosystem research, but at the same time, it's also too really important to provide access for visitors, for people to experience. So for us, it's that finding that balance between protecting the ecosystems, understanding the ecosystems, helping to keep them healthy, and allowing people to be connected, to enjoy, to get involved.
Mm-hmm. And at Point Pelee, one of the things you're trying to protect is that's in a major migration corridor. It's one of the world's most famous birding places. And so that protection goes well beyond the boundaries of just those, how big
Absolutely.
is it, 50?
15 square kilometers, which is about 8 square miles.
Yeah, which
yes,
isn't
that's
all that
right.
big. Yeah. And so we were also talking about kind of the connection, not just the place that you manage and protect, but its connection. And for Isle Royale, it's a connection to Canadian shore, it's a connection to Lake Superior. So what does it mean to protect that island in that national park?
Well, I think we're fortunate. Our users are some of the best in the world. So the people who come and visit just really help out by making sure their equipment's clean when they come there. They just do a marvelous job. But you can't do it by working just within your boundaries. Right. So for us, we were really fortunate when Canada put in the largest marine conservation area in the world.
Okay, so what is a marine conservation area? I'm not sure anybody in the Great Lakes thinks of themselves as marine, but knows that there's marine conservation areas in our Great Lakes.
Well, we are the inland seas,
yes.
So therefore marine is still an appropriate word. But Canada kind of seized on the idea that there needed to be freshwater reserves where you take a greater emphasis on protecting the fisheries, where you do look after, the local communities, but in the process you make sure there's a sustainable protected water environment. And we're fortunate that it butts up against a highly protected zone of the park, because the Isle Royale National Park is actually 3/4 water. It goes out 4.5 miles from all of the different islands, and it's great. And in working, so basically I keep in contact with my Canadian neighbors. The provincial parks help support some of the corridors for animals to possibly migrate. And one of our unique partnerships is with the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation, which is helping me develop new technology for aquatic invasive species treatment in ballast tanks of ships, which is something you would never imagine me doing possibly. Right. But I've worked with them and raised we've worked $3 million and have a very high-tech research program going on right now.
So what's neat about that is that's from Isle Royale, and that's a global impact.
It has a global impact. I went to Singapore actually and talked about the technology, and probably got a little more resonance there than I have here.
Yeah, so it's fascinating. That protection, that stewardship, and that care goes well beyond the borders of those preserves and those protected areas.
It's all about people getting involved. Like we can't do it ourselves.
Right. So it's fascinating to me when we were looking at the first video, we saw a couple signs of dedication or naming the parks, and you saw multiple logos on those signs, right? Those were, 4 or 5 different partnerships and logos. So you really can't do this type of thing by yourself. So can you give me some examples of Point Pelee's where you're working in those types of partnerships?
Most recently, we've been focused on restoration of our Lake Erie sandspit savanna, which is a globally threatened habitat. And we work with First Nations. The First Nations provide us perspective and focus on history of fire, because this is a fire-dependent ecosystem. Plus, they also help us along with, we have a program with secondary school students where they come in and they collect seed in the fall, take those seeds and then to their school greenhouses, propagate them, and then come back, and we have volunteer planting sessions in the spring to introduce those plants into the savanna. So yeah, we would not be able to do that magnitude of restoration without all of those helping hands.
And we've seen that again on the Keweenaw. It's a partnership of multiple organizations. I'm sure that bleeds over the short distance to IRL.
Well, it's kids can really be creative and help save a lot of things. We had a small high school build underwater cameras that you can, right now I'm the last place to get zebra mussels, thank God, in the Great Lakes, but I still am getting them, and these underwater cameras these kids have actually built, and they come out and operate them. We can go and look under our docks and at our dock with little disturbance in the water. So high-tech solutions can help us with some of the invasive species, but partnerships in general are making a difference. And the Keweenaw, that actually is my hometown, and I grew up there. And it's really the partnerships of conservancies that have stepped in and make a difference on that peninsula. And it's a mirror image of our Royal, but our Royal is fully protected, and the Keweenaw just has some very unique places.
Yeah. So we also were chatting a little bit earlier on about some of the other impacts or threats you face, and Phyllis, you mentioned something like about airborne pollutants. And again, it's not just a local problem you have to think about, but you have pollutants, heavy metals sometimes, that are coming in from hundreds and hundreds of miles away, and they have a local impact. So could you describe that process a bit?
Unfortunately, our Royal, because of its remoteness, in theory, was the last place to get air pollution. But when they went out and did lake sampling, they found it was the start of the whole air quality monitoring, one of the points of data that convinced people they needed to keep track of this. So right now, a couple of our lakes you can't take fish out of. The mercury and deposition content that's in the body fat of the fish is too high. So as a park manager, I'd like to have you, if you catch it, you could eat it if it made sense, but you know, and it's not on all lakes, it's just a couple of our windward lakes that get the drop of deposition as it comes across the period.
So it's surprising to me when I've gone to these places, and I think I'm the furthest place from anybody, but still I'm facing restrictions on what I might be able to catch and eat. So obviously these places had a big impact on your life's work, and that's great. So now we're going to move all over to Christy, and she's going to have a bit of a bigger view on some of the wilderness ideas and what wild places mean.
Hey, thanks so much, Patrick. You know, joining me now is Dr. John Knott. He's a professor emeritus from the University of Michigan, the English department, and he is also an author. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it, Dr. Knott.
Thanks.
All right, so why don't you go ahead and give me, what are some of your personal experiences with wild places, and how did it influence your writings and your teachings?
Well, the pivotal one was a 2.5-week canoe trip on the Noatak River in northern Alaska. With a small group, for the first time I understood what wilderness could be, big wilderness. The vastness, the silence, the absence of other human beings, coming to a gravel beach and finding only animal tracks. And this trip and trips I took with my wife, canoe trips in Ontario, at a time when I was reading the classics of American nature writing, prompted me to offer a course in literature of the American wilderness, and also to start teaching other courses in literature and the environment, and ultimately to be writing about it and editing books that had to do with wildness in some ways. And I found that I really enjoyed the students who were attracted to a course in wilderness literature. A lot of them were outdoor types. They were hunters, they were backpackers, they were canoeists and kayakers, people who had just grown up going to their family place on a lake. They came with real interest and passion to the course.
All right, so why don't you go ahead and back up for me and give me a little, what is the history, I guess, of wildness? And wildness isn't always perceived in a positive way, right? Has it always been perceived that way?
No, not at all. It's, there's been a revolution in the way we think about it. The first settlers in Michigan in the early 19th century, the first European settlers, thought they were entering the howling wilderness. That's what they called it. And there were dense forests, there were wolves, there were bears in southeast Michigan. One of these settlers, William Nowlin, wrote a memoir sometime later about describing how he helped his father clear the forests near what's present-day Dearborn, and the relief they felt at being able to see the sky. They were able to escape the gloom of the forest, he said, and to let in the light of civilization, which they thought it was. Yet at the same time, he became nostalgic for what they had lost, and he started talking about the grand old forest. And another settler writing about that time, looking back, talked about how the settlers burned most of the trees they cut down just to get rid of them, and said that was the first act of the great tragedy of subduing the forest. So there was a dawning of consciousness there. And at the same time, or a little later, writers were beginning to formulate positive ways of talking about wildness. Thoreau, certainly, who said we all need the tonic of wildness. And he found that lots of places, but in marshes outside Concord, Massachusetts, where he lived. His most famous comment in Wildness is the Preservation of the World reflected his sense that you could find transcendental truths in nature. Other writers at this time were beginning to use religious language to talk about nature, particularly forest, which they like to imagine as sacred spaces. They used metaphors of temples, cathedrals. People still like to talk about cathedral pines. And there is a rich tradition of writing about wildness and wilderness in this country, and it has some Midwestern roots. John Muir grew up on a farm in Wisconsin after emigrating from Scotland. Aldo Leopold spent most of his career in Wisconsin. Sigurd Olson made the boundary waters of northern Minnesota and southern Ontario his territory, and he wrote better about the North Woods than anybody I know, and about what he called the great silences of wilderness. And all these people talked about the appeal of wild places, as many writers have. And for me, the key appeal is that they invite us to slow down, to disengage from normal life, to pay attention to what our senses are telling us, to adapt to the rhythms of nature instead of clock time. And I remember when I used to take canoe trips, long canoe trips, I would leave my watch behind. It was just a gesture, but it helped somehow to get in the right frame of mind. Disconnecting, I thought, was critical. And I found, as many of you probably have, that it's more difficult to get younger people to disconnect these days. Most of them don't even have watches, but they have multiple electronic tethers.
So how do you think wild places are perceived today?
Depends on the person. Some people regard them as places for adventure. Some people go for the solitude, for the silence, and there's a lot of controversy about that.
So what are some of the controversies then?
Well, just to single out some particular ones, take forests, the management of forest lands, public lands in state parks, state forests, national forest. One basic question is, how wild do we want our wild places to be? And how do we measure wildness? And managers have to cope with a lot of competing demands and interest, and they have to pay attention to environmental laws. And they have to ask themselves questions like, how much old-growth forest should we manage for? How much early successional forest, aspen forest, which is prime habitat for grouse and white-tailed deer? What do we do when there's so many deer they start to change the structure of the forest? To what extent do we respond to the pressures, the public pressures, for more trails for snowmobiles and off-road vehicles? When does the fragmentation of the forest from trails and roads begin to do unacceptable damage to the biological diversity of the place? So another way to pose the question is, how actively do we manage our wild places? And I think the interesting thing is that we've gone all the way from the howling wilderness to designer forests, inevitably because so much has changed and so much is continuing to change. So managers have to ask themselves when to intervene, how to intervene. Even in wilderness areas, which are the most passively managed of all, there may be times when they feel they're being overrun by invasive species or something has happened where they have to step in. But there are no easy answers.
There are a lot of difficult questions. I was just going to say, Dr. John Knott, thank you so much for joining us and giving us that perspective. You know, so what is your favorite wild place in the Great Lakes? We went to social media, Twitter and Facebook, to ask people what they thought, and here were some of their top answers. Those are some amazing places, and I think probably, Patrick, they've given us some vacation ideas. Were you surprised at some of the places that people pointed out on social media?
You know what was neat about those is there's this great mix. You know, there were the iconic and maybe the not so iconic, right? And there's the big, and then there was kind of the next door nature aspect of them. But I think the common theme that you see across all of them in those brief words up there was there was this absolute personal experience with one of those places and something wild about them. I talked to my mom. I said, Mom, what's your favorite wild place? She said Point Paley, because she visited there during bird migration, and she had, you know, the chickadee come and feed out of her hand. And that moment in time when that little bird that weighs, you know, 5 ounces, 6 ounces, 7 ounces, or grams, I'm sorry, is landing on your hand, is that intimate experience. So I think that's what's fascinating to me about all those places around the Great Lakes. We have a few more minutes with our guests here, and I think, John, you brought up a really interesting point there, is about kind of when to intervene and when not to intervene, when to make a step towards management. And I don't want to, all these places are touched by the hands of people in some way or another, whether it's atmospheric deposition of some pollutants or anything. But I think you two, Marion and Phyllis, have faced some major controversies at both the places you work. One with cormorants, which is an overabundant native species that's native to the area, but has a big impact on the health of the landscape and fisheries. And another one here with climate change and moose and wolf interactions. One is very iconic, well studied, one of the most amazing stories in ecology that we have. So can you tell us a little bit about this controversy and how you've had to deal with it? You were an actual manager that had to face that.
That's right, and I would say that overall, going into the 21st century, that's one of the biggest challenges for park and protected area managers, is that whole dynamics of when do you intervene, when don't you intervene. And for us, it's about wild, but it's about healthy. And part of our jobs, of course, is researching and understanding how ecosystems work and what can go wrong when there aren't processes. So
you may have the cormorants who nest, and they might ruin the vegetation of an island and have an impact to the fisheries, but still they're part of the system.
That's right. But for us, also too, we're in a part of the country where there's very little wild places left. So what we have is very precious. And so as a national park, we're obligated to intervene when we see that there's an unhealthy situation in an ecosystem, and we have the means by which to, even though it may be very controversial, the whole concept of culling, to reduce numbers and to control numbers. We have to grapple with that.
Right. And the same thing Isle Royale, we have the wolf-moose interaction, we have populations that fluctuate, we have climate change entering the scenario. Tell us a little bit about that current controversy.
If you track it all, you're aware that climate change has reduced the number of ice bridges, which is the way wolves would come to Isle Royale. And Isle Royale, actually, the studies that were done there have, they're in most biology textbooks on predator-prey relationships. So we've learned a tremendous amount about these two iconic species, and I think the research has helped wolves get reestablished across the country as they showed really how they interact with their prey. But at this point, the wolves are genetically, they're not getting enough new blood, if you will, into the system, and their numbers are way down, partly attributed to that and lack of ice bridges, so they can't get replenishment. And the moose numbers are continuing to kind of fluctuate, but they're also on an all-time low. So what we've been trying to figure out, and we're going to take we've taken the first step at, well, wolves have to eat something. Will the moose survive? And so the first round of climate change analysis said, well, under 3 out of 4 scenarios, they don't possibly last past 50 years. In one, they do. The moose don't last. And so there would follow the wolves, possibly. So, but they also say this is the most difficult place to do climate change predictions in the world. No, all the models are based on continents without 5 big lakes sitting in the center creating their own lake. So we've said, you know, if we're going to try to sort this out, we're going to use the best data, the latest data. And we're in the middle of, we'll be starting next year, an environmental assessment of that whole process and looking at, if not moose, what's happening with caribou, because they're dropping off on the Canadian islands. There's an opportunity to really study island biogeography. That's our technical term for that. I can go geeky too, by the way.
Excellent.
Okay.
I'm all good.
And so people can engage on that issue and talk to us about what they think. You know, if a park is going to be an ark, what animals are invited on? And what will happen afterwards when you do that? Does it then become a continual source where you're managing? And we do manage with the capital W for wilderness at Isle Royale. It's a federally designated wilderness. It has a whole concept that it is a human construct. Nature just goes on its own, but we tend to try to, you know, define it.
So these are 2 big current controversies. When do we control cormorants? And culling is a nice way of saying when do we remove some of them. And a question of should we not intervene, reintroduce wolves or not introduce wolves, and then a whole climate change. Well, climate change is partially human caused, so therefore we should intervene. Well, there's all kinds of good discussions to have. John, it also was interesting to me when you pointed out that you set your watch aside, and again, I had the same reaction. I'm not sure anybody has a watch now to set aside because it's all on their phone or someplace else. But we're also, there's the pros and cons of that. I'm taking a trip with my family soon. Should we leave the electronics behind or should we take them with them? Because if we take them with them, we have all kinds of cool apps to learn about the places right hand and face. But it's nice to get disconnected sometimes too, and it's a breather. How are we going to deal with that kind of connection or disconnection in the future at these places?
That's a big controversy in the Park Service. But I also remember I went to the Galapagos Island and I took the Journey of the Beagle by Darwin with me. So for your young kid, that's no different from him taking his phone with the apps and me hauling a thick book along. So I think, but...
Can you tell them that for me just afterwards?
Okay, but so the question though comes to technology requires infrastructure, which requires a whole impact to a park or a wild place. And what level do you want to introduce that? So it is a big controversy.
But it is a necessary thing because we need people to enjoy these places, to love these places. So we have to connect.
Yeah. Well, you've given us a lot to think about today and a lot to talk about. So I guess, Patrick, as we head towards the end and wrap up, what are some of your final thoughts that we should be taking with us about these wild places around the Great Lakes Basin?
You know, again, what's fascinating to me is you travel around the Great Lakes, and all these places are almost a day's drive, maybe a little bit more, and you go from these really endangered oak savannas and these beaches and these dunes, and you travel through all these transitions to the great forest, to these Great Lakes and these great coasts. It's all just kind of right there, and you can, again, find that anywhere in your backyard to a very far away place. We're lucky, and I feel proud to know that these places exist, and I feel comforted to know they exist. And again, I invite people always, you got to get outside. You got to take that walk outside, and you can visit both electronically by visiting places like nature.org/wildplaces or Great Lakes Now, but you got to go see.
All right, thanks so much, Patrick. And that is going to do it for Great Lakes Now Connect. Thanks so much to Patrick Doran, of course, all of our special guests, and a big thanks to our audience here at Detroit Public Television. We hope that you've enjoyed exploring the wild places of the Great Lakes with us today. They are beautiful. They are unique and wonderful places to visit, but they're also integral to the health of our Great Lakes Basin and to the wildlife that thrive there. We hope today's show has inspired you not only to find out more, but to get involved in protecting these treasured wild places of the Great Lakes. To learn more, just go to our website, greatlakesnow.org. All of the information will be there for you. Plus, you can share this show with your friends. And thanks also to our partners at the Nature Conservancy of Michigan for all of their hard work. I'm Christy McDonald. We will see you next time on Great Lakes Now Connect. Take care.